Hey, you know who's the worst? Hitler. He was this German dictator guy in the 1930s and 40s, and he thought it'd be a good idea to start the biggest war in the history of humankind. And as if that wasn't enough, he also decided it would be a good idea to systematically execute millions of Jewish men, women, and children for no reason other than the merits of them being Jewish. He is rightly regarded as the biggest jerk in history, but it's really easy for us to sit around now and be like, oh, that guy was the worst. People should have done something. But what if you were actually there? How would you know when to do something? How would you know what he was actually going to be? And at that point, would it be too late? I mean, what about your own well-being? What about the well-being of your family? And further, what if you're a Christian and you've been taught that Christian good behavior in society is part of the way that Christians advance the cause of the gospel? I mean, you don't want to pick a fight with the government. You don't want to be violent in response to the government. Well, that's exactly the difficult spot that one man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer found himself in. He was a young pastor at the time that the whole Hitler train started picking up steam, and he just watched one thing after another fall into place, and he saw this persecution of Jews starting to gain momentum, and he started speaking out against it with his other pastor friends. People actually believed in the Bible and the gospel and Jesus and stuff. They're sticking up for the Jewish people. Well, Hitler, who say what you will about him, was real smart, knew that he had to nip that right in the bud. And so he calls this illegal conclave church vote thing where he brings together all of these Nazi propagandists and has them voted into position of church power all around Germany. And they go right to the pulpits and right to the typewriters and start talking about Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And I'm going to give you a second to pause and read that before I keep going, because knowing what this passage says is absolutely vital to following this flow of thought. So I'll be back in one sec. And if you just read that, you can see how well-meaning religious people would be like, as a face value read, that does seem pretty straightforward. I guess, like the Nazi leaders say, if a government's in power, it's probably right, and we probably need to do what it says, and we certainly can't push back. I mean, the Bible says that governments reward those who do good and only punish evil. It works. And it's one of the key propagandist movements in the whole Hitler thing to get a country of previously pretty sane people to go along with this train wreck of an idea. Well, Bonhoeffer's like, fine, we'll start our own church movement. So he gets a bunch of his buddies together. They start this thing called the Confessing Church. They speak out. They eventually have to go underground. They eventually start running this underground seminary to raise up a new generation of church leaders who wouldn't be indoctrinated in insane, violent Nazism. And as we get into wartime, Bonhoeffer becomes involved with the information community, the intelligence community within Germany, and he finds out the full scope of what is going on with the Holocaust. And at that point, he just feels absolutely compelled to do something about it. And so with reluctance and pain of conscience, wrestling with Romans 13, he decides to be a part of a group that is going to assassinate Hitler. The assassination is attempted, it fails, the people who are responsible are rounded up or were already imprisoned, and Bonhoeffer, 4, maybe 6 weeks before the Allies liberate Germany, gets executed, ironically, in a concentration camp. I bring up the Bonhoeffer story, and what I think we can agree is one of the most insane, radical, often used examples of government evil in all of history, to bring us to a place of thinking honestly about this Romans 13 thing. It is really easy to put up the Hitler piñata and just beat on that for a while, and it should be easy. But Romans 13 doesn't just come up in Nazi Germany. It comes up in a lot of places. Never by the people who are out of power, by the way. It's always invoked by people who are in power at any given time, and always pushed back on by people who are out of power. But even just this last week, the Attorney General of my country here invoked Romans 13. I would say clumsily at best, dead wrongly at worst. And I'm not going to talk about what issue he brought it up over, because it's not what this video is about. But I will say that it sparked a nationwide debate. I mean, there were cable news commentators with their Bibles out on TV. There were comedians with their Bibles out on late night TV, bloggers, interneters, everywhere. All of a sudden, everybody's a Bible expert, or maybe not a Bible expert, but everybody suddenly cares about the implications of this passage. Well, what does it actually mean? Because you know what? If we're to be totally honest about this, it looks like the straightforward face value reading of this passage would say what the Nazis said. But the reason that I don't think it means that is because of this other part of the Bible here. Just a second. And then this other part over here, including the maps. That face value read doesn't line up with the rest of what we see in the Bible. So what is going on in Romans 13? What does this teach us about a Christian obligation to the government that's around us, what we do, what we can never do, what we have to do? And I want to break this passage down in a weird way. Because this is such an oft misinterpreted passage, and because the historical consequences of misinterpreting this passage have been so great, I want to start with an old biblical interpretation technique that I think is pretty reliable. And that is, anytime you run into an unclear passage, you interpret it in light of the more clear passages. And I would again argue that the more clear passage is, the rest of the Bible. So I want to start with what I think this can't possibly mean. Then I want to talk about what I think it must mean. Then I want to talk about what I think it could mean. And then we're going to try to bring it home to something that we can do with all of that. But before we get into that fun outline, because I like history and because I don't want you to think that I'm the one guy in all of eternity who's not known what to do with this, here's the lightning fast rundown on what Christians through the ages have done with this passage. It looks like early Christians thought Jesus was coming back right away, so they were not freaking out about government. And it was easy for them to think, we just got to gut this out. It's a dictatorship anyway. There's nothing we can do. We've seen what happens to other religious sects that push back on Rome. So let's just put our heads down, focus on the kingdom, and Jesus will come back soon. But as Christianity rolls along a little more, it becomes evident, generation 2, generation 3, generation 4, that Jesus was talking about a little longer timeline. And as church and state start to merge in the 4th century under Constantine and especially under Theodosius, a theology of state has to develop. And one guy that's really instrumental in that is a very famous church father named Augustine. He wrote this famous book called The City of God, and in it he talks about these two cities that coexist in the world. The city of God, true believers who care about kingdom eternal stuff. City of man, people who care about carnal, pagan, fleshly, live today, tomorrow you may die kind of stuff. And he talks about how there will always be a conflict between these two and how right government will somehow curtail the impulses of the city of man. And Augustine, if I'm reading him right, even leaves the door open for the city of God to employ violence at times in restraining evil. In the centuries moving forward from Augustine, popes become the most powerful characters in Rome, and a theology evolves to figure out how power and government work between the pope and secular kings and stuff. And sometimes you hear this called the two-sword theology, the idea being that there's a spiritual sword that's the most powerful thing, and then the secular sword is a little less powerful. Both are from God, but this one, the spiritual, dictates to the secular. And so theoretically, popes should be able to appoint or de-appoint kings. And this explains even a lot of the political frictions of the High Middle Ages. Well, fast forward a little further, and there's this great Catholic thinker named Aquinas. And Aquinas is a little more pragmatic. He's got this kind of sense of there's some universal basic law that all of nature is governed by, and this is ordained by God. And it involves life and property and things like that. It sounds a little bit modern in this respect. And Aquinas seems to be arguing that there are some laws that when the government puts them in place, they're just an extension of God. They're just obvious, just laws. But if I'm reading Aquinas right, there's also an allowance that some laws are going to be more, cultural, a little bit more relative. And there, it would be best for the Christian to play along in the interest of greater things. Aquinas, again, sounds a lot like now. Fast forward to the Reformation. You run into Martin Luther. Luther kind of an advocate of separation of church and state. He felt like Christians should pretty much obey the government, but the government should stay out of Christian stuff. That kind of sets a standard that actually Hitler was the one who violated and broke up that tradition of separation when he pulled what he did in the 1930s. Other reformers, Calvin, well, similarly talked about these being two separate entities, the church and the state thing, and Christians should submit to both. But at the same time, Calvin had the belief that right government and a right community would be an example to the whole world, and so we really needed a state that was enforcing the values of God. And there was even an execution under Calvin's watch of someone who held what he believed to be heretical views. So we see his ideas play out a little more. Zwingli, another Swiss reformer, took it even further. It's like, no, it is out and out the role of the church to dictate, even co-opt the state, and violence might just be part of the equation. And he lived out this value by literally, as a pastor, leading his church into war against Catholics, where he died in battle. Fast forward into the Enlightenment age, and you start to get the thought that looks more like, let's just pick one from any number of these guys, Thomas Jefferson. Again, a healthy separation of church and state, but this is for the protection of the church. And of course, the church and its values will influence the state, but the state's unique role in using violence is something that should be really kept separate from anybody getting to co-opt it. And so therein you get kind of the modern American view of things. Fast forward even further into the 20th century after World War II. Well, at this point, I don't know, like cultural American Christianity kind of won. We beat the Nazis, and America is very well behaved, and its leadership seems super Christian, and government values seem super Christian, God and country. And so it was very easy in this moment for American religious leaders to interpret Romans 13 at face value. Like, yeah, do what the government says. And they were just picturing like everyone must submit themselves to, and where governing authority is, insert like Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, Ike is great. I like Ike. He's a Christian and he does nice things. And so when you fit him in there, it was easier for them to say, hey, Christians, come on, get on board, cooperate this. And also to kind of rope in maybe more liberal Christians a little bit to their vision of the world. Obviously, that passage interprets a little bit differently. If you say everyone must submit themselves to Nero and Herod, for there is no authority which God has established, or that God has not established. I mean, whatever leader you fill in there is going to color your reading of the passage. Well, here's why I'm getting it. A lot of the Christian leaders at that time wrote the books that informed the Christian leaders of the next generation or two. And so that read on Romans 13, which made great sense in the 1950s, doesn't make as much sense moving forward, but it keeps getting repeated. Get into the era of the counterculture and the religious right, and even now, and you can see that, our government isn't really very Christian and does some pretty weird stuff depending on who's in power. And so that has put Christians in the unique position of saying, well, did we read Romans 13 wrong? Is Paul doing something different than the face value read on that? I'm sorry, Ronald. He'll be fine. Ironic, they were talking about this, and Ronald Reagan just literally like rolled off the shelf, like rolling over in his grave. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to keep going. And so all of a sudden, it's like, well, maybe we need to just change the government so that it behaves better and becomes a government that we could apply the face value read of Romans 13 to again. And that explains a lot of the Christian right and Christian activity in our lifetimes. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with everything or nothing that the Christian right thinks. What I am saying is you kind of get the impulse a little better when you look at this historical friction with the principles dealt with in Romans 13. Maybe if we fix government, then this passage reconciles itself. So the reason I take the time to walk through all of this history is just to point out that, hey, if you feel friction with this passage and the face value read is hard for you to reconcile with reality and the Bible, join the club, a club occupied by like the smartest Christians of all time. In my experience, it is only those who are arguing for the political power of their team or those in political power themselves who will consistently throw out the wooden face value read of this passage. I think just about everybody else, people who have nothing to gain, suspect that there's something more going on here. Now let's get into the part where we talk about what this can't mean. First of all, big picture. I think this can't mean a treatise on government. And if somebody points you to Romans 13 and says, that's the biblical view of government, I would say, okay, well then that settles it. The Bible doesn't really have much to say about how government ought to be. There's no preferred type of government in the entire Bible other than the theocracy that God wanted to put in place in the Old Testament to rule his own people under his own laws without a human king. But his own people didn't want that. They went to the prophet Samuel and were like, give us a real king, like muscles and a cool beard and a spear and all of that. And Samuel's like, I don't know if you want to do that because he's going to tax you and conscript you and send your boys off to war to die for his dumb, stupid government pursuits. Are you sure? And they were like, yeah, we're sure. That's what we want. And for the second time in the Bible, effectively, people ate of the fruit. And so that's the ideal form of government. God is king. All the other forms seem to just come and go. There's no advocacy for democracy or republic or anything like that. The idea throughout the Bible is that good government can only be provided by the truly good king. And ultimately, that's Christ. That the values of the kingdom that he talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, did like 10 videos on that a while back. You can look those up if you want to know more about what that stuff is. These kingdom values are different than government values. They're different from world values. World values are predicated on the idea that you're only going to be alive for a little bit, so get yours. And if you got to run over some people, do it. If it benefits you to be nice to people, do that. But ultimately, it all washes out in the end, and that's that. Kingdom values are predicated on the idea that there is a king who is doing something that's redemptive and beautiful, and that we're invited to it. And that what he's redeeming is that corrupted system of world values. And so Christians are invited to live with a completely upside down set of values, antithetical to the world. And that makes us weird and different. And so the theme throughout the Bible seems to be, if you do the Christian thing, it's going to be weird. You will not neatly be able to fit what you are into the equation that the world gives you in terms of who you kill and when you kill them and who you steal from and what you do. It's a little bit rejectionist, if we're to be totally honest. So I reject the idea that Romans 13 is some kind of treatise on how government ought to be. I also think that Romans 13, 1-7 cannot mean that God establishes authority, therefore they're automatically right when they act. I will definitely grant that it means that God has established all authority. More on that in just a minute. But this conclusion that the Nazis took us to, and that lots of other people have taken us to, is that if God allows these authorities to exist, that somehow they're right. Well, rationally, that doesn't make any sense, because God allows me to continue to exist. He's the author and sustainer of all things, including me. And I can tell you something that I know about me through tremendous amounts of empirical data gathering. I have problems. I am wrong. Not all of my choices are right about things, which means that God both affirms, allows, and created my existence, and does not affirm everything that I think or do. Why would it be different with the government? Further, we know they're wrong about stuff. The Sermon on the Mount points out their wrongness. When Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, I'm going to say 6. If it's wrong, I'll put the correction up here. When Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 says, don't take your lawsuits to the government. Like, why would you go there? I don't know what they're doing. It's a very low view of their ability, the state's ability to sort it out. Paul instead is saying, sort it out amongst you all who are sharing kingdom values. And how many examples can we come up with of governments doing bad things? Like, I don't know, infanticide twice. I mean, there's that. And we're totally against that, I think. I don't know. There's the other time when somebody was saying, no, I probably won't bow down and worship you. And they're like, cool, I'll just throw you in a furnace, or have you eaten by lions? Like, I'm pretty sure we're against that. What about that time that dude had that stripper come in to his king party? And then he's like, stripper, that was awesome stripping. What do you want? And she's like, I just want you to behead somebody. And he was like, you're the stripper. And then he did that. That's awful governing. These people are all wrong about everything. And that's the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the Bible makes it clear that just because God allows an authority to be in place or even orders that authority in place does not mean that authority is right. Oh yeah, and how about all the prophecies about all of these other governments and what God's judgment is going to look like on them? So we can dismiss that Nazi propaganda idea out of hand and immediately. A second thing that it can't mean is that God only punishes bad people. Now, I get why people would read it this way. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. It does seem really straightforward. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. But I can think of one really prominent counterexample to interpreting this as a universal statement, and that would be the life of the dude for whom the religion is named. Do you remember Jesus from the Bible? And how the Bible describes him as actually being really a pretty good guy. Like, it actually even goes so far as to say he didn't do anything wrong. He was without sin, and the government still executed him. That is not commending him for doing good. So either Paul is completely unfamiliar with his Savior who he met on the road to Damascus and completely forgot all the other things he's written, even within the letter to the Romans that we're reading right now, or that isn't a universal statement of what governments always do. Perhaps it's an ideal, but certainly not a universal statement. And I mean, again, 50 more examples if we wanted them. The execution of James, the fact that Mary and Joseph had to flee from infanticide, Stephen being executed completely illegally, by the way, you name it. A third thing that I think, or am I on 4? It doesn't even matter at this point. Another thing that I think this passage cannot mean, based on the context, is that you're not allowed to criticize the government. In Luke, I think I wrote it down, Luke 13:32, Jesus calls Herod a fox. He basically says, you tell that fox, and it's not even the masculine form of fox. Oh my goodness. Jesus called an authority who God established a female dog. Maybe it didn't have the same implications. I'm not saying go out and call everybody that or whatever. You do what you need to do. I'm just saying that is obviously a derogatory term that Jesus was firing back to say, I don't have tremendous respect for what that guy just said or what that guy just did. No, governments are going to be criticized. God criticizes governments. Although you have to admit, the early church was pretty conservative in what they said against government. But even then, you look at that first third of the book of Acts when it goes through that cycle again and again of Peter and the disciples went to the temple and they got arrested and flogged. They were really direct. Peter definitely said, Jesus Christ, whom you crucified. He was calling them out for being wrong. So I don't know if Peter and Jesus were wrong, then I guess this could mean don't criticize the government. I think Peter and Jesus were right, and I think something other than the rigid face value read is what Paul is doing in Romans 13. More on what that might be in just a minute. Here's another thing I don't think it can mean. That the government or the authorities is just whoever claims authority at any given time. If you game this out in the most literalist, legalistic read, which authority are you supposed to honor? What if you live in eastern France before all of France was occupied by Germany? Should you then obey Hitler? Or should you keep fighting against Hitler on behalf of the French? Should you only have switched that loyalty once the tanks rolled into Paris? At what point do you stop? And what about after Hitler was dead? I mean, he could have had a successor or something. What if the British government comes along and says, hey, there's a thing called the Quartering Act now, and it means that you have to aid and abet British soldiers in fighting against and killing your neighbors. But you didn't really want to pick a side, but now you either have to obey that government or obey the local claims to government. Which authority is it? Are you just automatically sinning and in the wrong either way? It's just the simple complexity of history and the complexity of the question of what authority actually means tells me that this cannot be interpreted rigidly and literally because authority is a very temporal, very flexible thing. I guess I'd throw this out as well. If you are a Christian living in occupied ISIS territory, do you obey ISIS? I mean, I would think you would resist ISIS, but hey, I mean, if they drew red lines around a circle on a map, no, I just don't think it can mean that. Another thing that I don't think this can mean is that you can't disobey the government. The government says something, it's right, and you have to do it. Now, clearly, this passage is saying, more on this in a minute, that Christians should obey all just laws, no questions asked. I think the larger context of Romans and the whole Bible supports the idea that even silly laws are a good idea to be in compliance with whenever you possibly can, for the same principle that Jeremiah in prophecy is throwing out to the Jewish people being hauled off into captivity in Babylon. Like that famous, what is it, Jeremiah 19:29? I'm even getting that right? It's so famous. And whatever. The one about, I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you. All of that falls in the context of Jeremiah saying, go behave well under this foreign dictator. And in doing so, people will see what God is about. Those are tough instructions. So there is a biblical impulse toward, look, if it doesn't hurt you, and if it's more or less an okay-ish law, it's probably usually better to put your head down and think in kingdom terms than to think about being constantly in a state of rebellion. Nothing good comes out of that, and this isn't the kingdom we're freaking out about all the time anyway. But to take that the step further and say, don't disobey the government, like the Nazis did with this passage, can't possibly mean that. It can't possibly mean that. And it's not just Nazis who argue that. Other people, even in this country, when their team's in power, will argue this is what that passage means. But let me see. Mary and Joseph, they disobeyed the government. Herod said, we're going to kill all these babies. Like, you have to help. I mean, you don't want to resist a government order. And they resisted, and they were right. How about the Magi? God told them to resist the government. And it was a seemingly harmless command. Just swing back by here. You see anything? There's just no reason. Just want to know. I actually wanted to go say hi to the baby myself. Just pay him honor. And the Magi are told, nope. So they disobey a government and an authority that's in charge. How about Peter? Remember the time right after James got executed in the middle of Acts, and Peter gets out of jail miraculously? Like, leaving jail without permission, like, that's a crime. It's super illegal. Otherwise, jails would be optional. And then I would think most people would not go to them. So Peter, rather than being like, oh, okay, like Paul did in Philippi, instead, he's like, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I'm out. And he flees. Well, that is resisting arrest, too strong a word. I mean, it's a prison break. It's illegal. So we see all of these examples affirmed within the scriptures of people disobeying the government at times. Now, you will hear people say all the time, well, of course. And in my rigid literal reading of Romans 13, I see it the same way. You should do all these things unless the government is wrong. But where does it say that in Romans 13, 1-7? I don't see that at all. There's no allowance here. So you can't have the goose and the gander, your cake. You can't have your stupid cake and eat the goose at the same time, because either you go with the literal rigid read, which says no exceptions, or you understand that something different must be going on here, and you read this with a bit more nuance to get closer to what the rest of the Bible is teaching. The way the rigid literalistic read of this passage collapses on itself is only exaggerated when we look at those who advocate for saying it this way. Nobody who's saying the government should be obeyed under all circumstances and is the maker of truth and is always right would say that about North Korea or Iran or, again, ISIS. We're always picturing America or Australia or, I don't know, wherever you're from that you think is good when we talk about this passage. So there's an inconsistency even in the way we interpret it there. But there's one more inconsistency here, or one more challenge to this read. It's a wrinkle that I want to throw out, and maybe this is in the right place in this whole presentation to do it, but it's going to happen here. This was written to people who were following a guy, Nero, who literally gained power by having his mom poison his stepdad to death. Then when his mom became in some way a threat to him, he had her killed as well, and she survived the assassination attempt, and the actual killing was even much uglier because, just a brutal, ruthless murderer to gain power. There is nothing godly about the way this guy came to power. And everybody in the original audience would have known that by this point. So we're talking about a dictator. And everybody knew this dictator, he wasn't voted on. There's no process here. It was just poisoning. Whereas if we do picture our own country or our own circumstances now, it's a really different thing. Like if you live in America, you are 1/300,000,000th king. You, if anything, are on, in part, the other side of this equation, or have a foot in both worlds of this equation in terms of the relationship between the individual Christian and the state. And I think that throws a wrinkle in it as well that's worth pointing out. All right, I'm actually having to restrain myself from talking more about what this passage can't mean in the rigid literal reading, but we got places to be, so I'm going to get on to the next thing. What must this passage mean? Because I think there is stuff here that we can take from it, and it's not that tough. The opening line of Romans 13 is inarguable. There is no authority except that which God has established. And so this notion of submission that comes right before that, well, on the grand existential scale, of course this is true. If God is the sovereign over all of existence, the owner of everything, then, well, yeah. If something exists, if someone exists, if an institution exists, it is within his permission and good pleasure that it does so. Obviously, do not confuse that with affirmation. Like, I don't know, deer get into my yard sometimes and chew up my stuff, scrape up my tree, and I don't like that. But I also don't just go out with a shovel or a rake and beat them to death. I don't know, like, I'll allow it, I guess, because right now it doesn't seem like the right move to deal with that. But I'm definitely not happy about that. I like analogies where I get to be God. I don't know, maybe that one breaks down a little bit. But what I am sure of is that God is sovereign over everything. And so God is sovereign over authorities. It doesn't mean they do what he wants. Of course it doesn't. The whole story of the fall of creation is about things existing under God's authority, but being allowed for the time being, for his purposes, to go their own way and do what they're going to do. But we also see the theme throughout the Bible that kings are pawns, they're jokers, they're clowns. Xerxes in Esther is a comic presentation of someone who imagines himself to be a god king who is the maker of all authority and truth and virtue. And he's like easily manipulated by people behind the scenes. He doesn't make one decision for himself in the entire book. And the contrast is with the God who you don't hear mentioned in Esther, who makes every decision for himself because he's actual authority. Pharaoh. God just did stuff with Pharaoh, moved him around like a chess piece. Proverbs 21 says that, it was a terrible paraphrase, but it's close, like the hearts of kings, that God maneuvers those like a water course. So at no point in the Bible do we see God ceding control to kings as though he goes to them for permission to do what he's going to do. Even Jesus on trial with Pilate is like, knock yourself out, I guess. My kingdom's of another world, so whatever. So it definitely means that everything that's established, God is over in terms of sovereignty, and he has it all ordered and is aware of what's going on. I think it also means what I mentioned earlier. Christians should obey all just laws. And I might even stretch it a tick further beyond this passage to say it seems like the biblical idea is if a law is obeyable at all, I don't know, just pay the stupid thing, do the stupid law, whatever. It's just not our first calling to obsess about that stuff and push back on it. Now I want to get into the slightly more nuanced stuff. This is where we get into the trickiness of the read, but this is, I think, the heart of it. What could this passage mean? What might Paul be doing here that would help us explain this less clear passage in light of the more clear stuff, which is the rest of the Bible? The first thing this passage could mean is that Paul is talking about an ideal for how government works and not how things actually are in execution. Like everybody reading this passage would have been picturing two names, Nero and Herod. It's like the worst two people of the first century. Caligula was really bad too. These are two of the worst people of the first century. Everybody would have known that these guys were awful and were clowns and that they don't do any of these things. But maybe Paul is saying this is how it should be, even though rulers don't tend to get it right. Maybe he is invoking some of the same sentiment as what Jesus talked about in Matthew 7, when he talks about, well, ideally, a tree is going to produce good fruit. Obviously, we all know that bad trees exist, and when that happens, those branches or those trees get busted up and they get thrown into the fire. Could be. A second possibility, it could mean that we're just talking about a very limited scope here. That Paul, where he seems to be talking about justice, is describing the most basic things, those things Aquinas pointed to. Basic, the physical justice for the person and for life, and justice regarding stuff and possessions. Those two most basic universal elements that most governments, honestly, get pretty right. Even awful governments usually punish people who murder other people, and usually don't allow kidnapping, and usually if you steal stuff, you get in trouble. If governments don't get that right, they get deposed really quickly. So maybe Paul is talking about something very limited in scope, and he's saying, as it pertains to this, they generally get it right, and we certainly want to resist that aspect of government, which is basic justice. A third thing that this could mean, again, these are all could mean, you don't have to think anything that I'm actually saying here, but thanks for hearing me out. Third thing is that this is a continuation of the narrative theme in Acts, that this young fledgling church that Christ has vested with this whole future of his redemptive plan is in a pretty perilous spot. Maybe just a few executions away from being out of leaders. And so we see God miraculously preserve his young, vulnerable church throughout Acts. Well, Romans is happening, probably during Acts. And so maybe Paul, who was both a source for the authorship of Acts that Luke no doubt depended on, and a subject, a main character of the book of Acts, is just running with the same theme, and he's trying to set his people up to survive whatever's going to go down with Nero. There's no way that a handful of Christians who had recently just been kicked out of Rome by Nero's stepdad, Claudius, there's no way that these guys are going to overthrow Nero and make a Christian utopia in Rome. It's a fool's errand. Everybody who's tried this stuff with Rome gets dead. A couple years after this letter was written, the Jews are going to try it. And they not only get dead, their temple gets wrecked. Bloodshed all over the place. The Romans won't put up with it. Maybe what Paul understands here is, look, you have no violent recourse here. None. You have no political recourse here. None. And if Nero gets so much as a whiff of that's what you're up to, the entire church in Rome is over. So just don't. Which means that what this could mean is that Paul is sending a very intelligently worded message to his people that they will get and that we can get under a closer eye, but that Nero would not. Remember, this letter is to the Romans. He mailed this to Rome. He wrote a letter talking about another kingdom and another set of values to the seat of power of the entire world. If Nero reads this, and there's reason to think he might, he's got to feel good about what he's reading and that the Christians are no threat, or this letter will be their immediate death sentence and the end of the church in Rome, at least for that time. I don't think Paul wants to write that letter, or write that death warrant, maybe I should say. So he frames this in a way where everybody will know how absurd it would be to imagine Nero being the good guy, but Nero could read it and in his arrogance be like, well, they don't pose a threat, and I like this Paul fellow. He is right in keeping with his view of government, and he is right in step with how I myself view it. A fifth possibility of what could be going on in this passage is an extension of the principle put forth in 1 Peter, where Peter says, look, if you get punished, don't let it be for being murderers or rioters or rule breakers or whatever, but if you get punished for following Christ and doing Jesus stuff, okay, well then count that an honor. And that is the worst paraphrase of the day. I'll put the actual passage up over here so you can feel like you actually encountered the Bible here. Well, this seems in keeping with that principle. Look, if you guys get in trouble and it's for Jesus, you got in trouble and it's for Jesus. Paul eventually got in trouble for Jesus from Nero, who had him beheaded with a sword. So, Paul was game. Paul understood how this thing was going to play out. But you don't want to go around picking fights. You undercut your witness. You just look like another rebel group. When's the last great big giant rebel group that through violence and bloodshed and warfare redeemed the world through love? I can think of groups that have done religious things through violence, but their legacy has just been violence after that. No, Christ is calling for something different. Paul is urging them to something different. Peter is urging them to something different. Another thing that this passage, I think 6, could mean is found in looking at the larger context of Romans itself. I don't have time to break this all down one verse at a time, but you have Bibles in the interwebs and you're smart and you can play along if you want to. It seems like in the last portion of this letter of Romans, where Paul is explaining like the nuts and bolts of theology and what it is to follow God and what it is to be the church and Christians in the world, in this last chunk, he gets into relationships and how do you live and what does that look like practically speaking. And the transition happens in the very famous verse that leads chapter 12, which says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." The block of thought that we're dealing in Romans 13, 1 through 7, starts right there. So the thesis statement is, if you are a Christian, you are already dead. You are a living sacrifice. You're still walking around, but you've already been offered. And that offering is one that is to be pleasing to God, whose plan for you transcends this physical mortal world and this mortal body by infinity plus infinity. Then he goes on to talk about, in light of that, if that's who we are, and this is what the gospel has done in our lives, it has a lot of ramifications for how we treat each other. And so the emphasis on humility and unity and no ovations about overthrowing governments or anything like that is what comes next. Next, there's talk about genuine Christian community and neglecting the human impulse toward revenge. You will be wronged. Don't take vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So we leave that to God. That's a very kingdom value thing to do, very not worldly thing to do. But on the contrary, like feed people, take care of people, do things that are redemptive, exemplify the redemptive, grace-giving love of Christ in whatever circumstances you find yourselves in. Well, here's part of that living sacrifice thing, gang. You have to work with the government, and the government wields the sword. And look, God, who is sovereign over you, is also sovereign over the government. And that might mean that we get into some weird spots, but hey, I mean, all these powers are, of course, imperfect. I don't need to write it down right here. We're talking about Nero. Of course, they're imperfect. There's no reason to beat that dead horse. But look, God is sovereign over all of the things that feel beyond your power. What feels more beyond our power than government? So it's okay. And further, if you owe them stuff, I don't know, just pay them stuff. Whatever, it's fine. Don't leave some debt outstanding with the government because you're trying to make some point. Live kingdom values right now. Worry about that. But you know what debt you shouldn't let remain outstanding? Verse 8 of Romans 13, love. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt of love to one another. Okay, well, he phrased that a little differently. I mean, you get the point. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. Oh, okay. So I'm not just making stuff up. There is a reason to suggest that Paul is doing something subtle here in acknowledging, yeah, there's a government, but I'm not talking to the government right now. Not one word of this is Paul addressing to the government. He's not telling them what they should do or what they shouldn't do. This is meant to fly right past them. He's saying, Christians, you can't control any of that. Don't worry about that. You can control you. And here's what you need to do. Like, if you need to settle up with people. But make sure that you love each other because the law, the thing the government makes, is fulfilled in all of this. This is the truest, realist thing. And further, he goes on to wrap it up saying, time is short. Whether Jesus is coming back or you're going to die, time is short. And so that principle is implicit of, look, for the most part, we can roll with this in the interest of kingdom stuff. So if we look closely, here's what I think is really going on. Paul has spent all of this Romans 13 talking about what it looks like to live like a Christian. The eternal perspective is dripping off of every word of this. That eternal view, that sense of being transformed by the amazing grace of God is something that changes the way we think about other people. It changes the way we think about just getting through the week and getting through the day. And that's important, and that has implications. And even for something that seems like as big a deal as government, your kingdom citizenship matters more. Your loyalty to this other stuff matters more. This is not some two kingdoms theology where we have responsibilities in both and they're kind of equal and we do both. No, it is a one kingdom theology that Paul is arguing for here. Your first loyalty as a Christian is to Christ. And the way we manifest that is by having all of our decision-making processes run through the filter of, is this glorifying to God? Does this promote and expand his kingdom? Does this show love and the gospel to other people? That is what Christians are about. This is a passage that I think is meant to hand wave the obstacles and the big things that get right in front of Christians and cause us to get tripped up with that which is temporal and stupid and even violent and awful, and to replace it by saying, just kingdom, kingdom, kingdom. We're kingdom people. So what does that actually look like when we're Dietrich Bonhoeffer and we run into a Hitler? Here's my answer. I don't know. I don't know. If there was one blanket response for every single time, the Bible would include it. If God wanted there to be a manual for here's what you do depending on the level of offense of the government, he could have written a book about that just detailed every single one, and then we'd know exactly what it's supposed to be. But instead, as is overwhelmingly the case in the Bible, God chooses to deal in principles. He chooses to lay it out in such a way that you have to think. You have to take actual ownership for what you do and how you live and how you function as a Christian in this world where you are a stranger and a foreigner. You have to figure out how to be salt and light and redemptive, even in the face of people like Nero, even in the face of people like Hitler. Was Bonhoeffer wrong? I don't know. I know people who think he was wrong. I know people who think he was right. I am not his judge. I don't know. I don't know. We're going to get over a barrel with not just government, but with the structures of this world in general. If you read the Sermon on the Mount and you listen to Jesus and you hear what he's describing about these kingdom values, they're just going to clunk. They're not going to mesh with what we're doing here. And that's going to put us in spots where we're going to be at a loss sometimes. Thankfully, the whole relationship with God is predicated on grace. And he has an unending and amazing capacity to forgive our well-intentioned but completely botched attempts at getting it right. Which this entire video might be. You do not have to think anything I think about this. I could be dead wrong on every single point. I think I'm not, or I wouldn't make a video about it and put it on the internet. But there's some stuff in the Bible, easy passages, it's pretty straightforward. Salvation comes through Christ alone plus nothing. I'm really, really sure about that. Yeah, this one's tough. I feel like I got the flow of it. I feel like I'm tracking with what God is saying about these frictions throughout the Bible. But if you're getting to the end of this and you're feeling like that guy is an idiot, he's completely off, know that you may have a point there. I hope that if nothing else, my attempts and my passion, which came through a little bit in this video, will be taken as something that will prompt thought and help you to reason it through for yourself and figure out what you do. I'll tell you this, it's worth thinking through. If you want to do the Christian thing or even the think about the Bible thing from a non-Christian perspective, this passage needs your attention. Even if you don't want to mess with this passage, people are going to bring it to your doorstep and they're going to put things in front of you that don't seem like very good ideas using this as backing. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how we nuance out the rest. You're patient. You're awesome. I love that we can have a conversation like this here. Thanks for being a part of it. I'm Matt. This is a 10-Minute Bible Hour. We'll see you soon.